today's video, we're gonna take Drazar, the most lethal incubi in the dark city of Camorra, and we're gonna convert him into a hierarch, the head honcho of an incubi shrine. A lot of people have been asking me how I painted up my incubi, and in this video, I'll show you the process. But first, we need to make some changes. I love the composition of this model. He has a super strong money angle with his ponytail kind of curving around his back wingdinger things, and the front blade being very visible and strong, but the back one kind of framing the rest of the model. That being said, there are some things that I do want to change about it. I've never been a fan of the broken soulstone necklace that he has around his neck. It blocks all that glorious incubi chest armor that we get to see on all the other dudes, and it also shadows like his entire torso. It like makes all that part pretty illegible. I'm also gonna make a few other cosmetic changes to make him feel less like Drazar and more just like a special incubi leader in my army. My army is, kind of poor and not well off, so I might swap out one of his weapons for a different gladiator style weapon. And maybe one other change that some 40K players might deem as a little heretical. To get started on our conversion, we'll begin with the removal of the necklace. I find it's easier to start with removal than it is to start adding things. With the rougher removal complete, I'll use a combination of my X-Acto knife, some sanding twigs, and files to smooth out the chest and create some panel lines where there should be some and are none. If you're doing this conversion with a fresh Drazar, I'd recommend that you actually assemble the model with the necklace, let it fully dry, and then do exactly what I'm doing here. I find the plastic part actually fills a lot of his chest cavity very nicely. The head was kind of getting in the way during this process, so I just removed it. With a couple of Dark Eldar bits at my disposal, I found a great weapon that I thought would work well for his back arm. I want to keep the front arm with the typical incubi blade because it's just so iconic. Drazar is just full of so many thin, spindly bits that are sticking out so far. I think I broke off at least 2 parts at some point in this process. With the arm cleanly removed, we're gonna do one more bit of extreme removal, which requires some power tools. I'm gonna replace Drazar's head with a different head. In order to get started with that, we need to grind out this neck stump that was left behind when trying to remove it. And the head I'm gonna be using is this one. Now I know incubi are supposed to have helmeted heads. It's kind of their entire vibe to be silent, solemn killers. But I think of characters like Cobb Vanth in The Mandalorian, who had Mandalorian armor and took his helmet off so unceremoniously, and that was kind of like a shocking thing. What if my incubi don't really care about the statutes of what the incubi brotherhood is supposed to follow, and they're kind of just more rebellious? That's good enough for me to use this absolutely sick head. With the model and head attached to some handles to make it easier for holding, I'll base my model in some khaki. I'm gonna start zenithly highlighting this model with lighter and lighter colors, and as I increase in brightness, I'm also gonna increase in dilution. The more diluted my paint is with the airbrush, the more translucently it applies, and the more gradual my blends can be. The airbrush is so good at applying uniform layers of thin, transparent paint, so take advantage of that as much as you can. To have an easier time airbrushing with these steps, here are a couple of tips. I find that it can be easier to airbrush with matte paint, which may at first sound a little counterintuitive. It's a bit of a double-edged sword. On one hand, because of its matte finish, it has this micro, rough surface texture that paint really clings to at the moment that it hits the model. Matte paint really reduces the chances of spiderwebbing in this case, or where the air pressure of the airbrush blows away the still wet paint and causes what looks like a spiderweb to form. Where matte paint isn't so great is where it has a tendency to show off your lack of blending and really showing off airbrush grain. Another great and fundamental way to blend with an airbrush is by holding the brush pointed at one spot on the model and just doing very tiny little pulses right at that spot over and over again until your highlight gets larger and larger, just like I'm doing on this calf right here. I want you to notice how little I'm pulling back on the airbrush trigger. With the white highlights complete, we're going to continue using the airbrush to apply some shadows with a sepia color. One thing else I want you to notice about these airbrushing steps is how close I'm getting to the miniature. I am turning down my PSI and thinning my paint quite a bit to allow for this to happen. I'm airbrushing around 15, 14, 13 PSI about. It's probably worth mentioning why I'm going through all this airbrushing, highlighting, shading trouble. Basically, what I'm trying to do is to create blends that you can actually see from the tabletop while you're standing slightly above the model playing a game. I find that all too often when hobbyists do a zenithal undercoat, you can only really see the shading if you look at the underside of the model, which is not what I'm going for. If that's the case, then I've failed. I'm trying to be more aggressive, less realistic, but also, in my opinion, just cooler looking by getting some of these blends and shades more exaggerated. Next, we're gonna break out a yellow contrast paint to break up some of this white armor by painting some of the panels with yellow. Yellow is an important color in my scheme, and I want to make sure that even though these guys are painted in mostly cream and black, that they still have some yellow on them. With the yellow complete, I'll start to base coat some of the other ribbon and fabric details with a military green color. With a mixture of Army Painter Grim Black, a little bit of black ink, and some Speed Paint Medium, I'm going to paint his undersuit. I often find that a lot of blacks from Contrast Paint, Speed Paint, Express Paint are often not black enough, so I mix a little bit of ink in just to give it a bit of a boost. But if I'm being totally honest, it doesn't really solve the problem for me entirely. Basically, I want a near black gray that I can highlight one time with the gray paint and then be done. And so far, no transparent black paint out of the bottle does that for me. In preparation for our next step, we're gonna hit Drazar with a bunch of gloss varnish. And in order to make sure we get a nice glossy finish, I'm gonna apply multiple layers of this stuff. And what's that next step, you ask? Oil washing, baby. To get my color, I'm mixing mostly burnt umber, but I'm also adding in a little bit of ivory black just to darken it up a bit. I've been playing around with oil washes a lot lately, and I've started to get some really satisfying results. And I think the key to getting great oil washes comes down to the mix and also patience. You want your oil wash to be as thick as possible while still being able to wash into all the recesses. The thicker your paint, the less it's going to spread out to all the flat surfaces, but also gravity won't affect the paint as much as it's standing there and drying. Sometimes if your oil wash is too thin, it sinks all to the bottom of the model. To test that I got the right consistency, I'll try the oil wash out on an inconspicuous part of the model, like the back of his calf. When you're done with your test, give it about 5 minutes to dry and then check it out. In my experience, the paint spreads out no matter what, but what you want to see is a remaining dark ring around the detail you care about, and it's still there, so I'm pretty confident with this mix. I find that the mixture of oil paints and mineral spirits splits pretty easily, and even if you have the right combo at the beginning of an oil wash paint job, by the end it may split a little bit and you discover that you're using a thinner mixture than you actually anticipated. So every once in a while, give it a good stir. Now, the model is going to look ugly after this stage, but don't worry. All we need right now is a little bit of patience. About 12 to 16 hours of patience. Now, maybe you thought that I varnished the model to protect it from the mineral spirits, but that's not the case. I varnished it for this step. Now, after a nice long cure time and a makeup sponge lightly dipped in mineral spirits, I can wipe away virtually all of the paint on those flat surfaces, leaving behind a crispy brown line that outlines all of these awesome Drakari armor panels. The glossy varnish also helps the wash to break surface tension more easily, but honestly, this is the step that really benefits from a nice glossy finish. Surprisingly, I'm able to modify the oil wash even multiple days after applying it. In this clip you're watching right now, the oil wash has been drying for over 3 days. With the oil wash looking great, I sealed my fate with some matte varnish. With the varnish dry, I took some dark brown paint and fixed up some of those recessed shades that didn't look so good. On my normal incubi, this is a step that I would normally skip, but I figure I make Drazar look as good as I can. This kind of issue mostly occurs on the little spikes you find all over Dark Eldar miniatures. With the shading totally complete, we're going to do one edge highlight of pure white pretty much all over the armor. I may skip some edge highlighting on the parts that are lower on the figure, like on his feet and shins, etc. I don't know about you guys, but when I wake up, I immediately want to be at work. If I could literally roll out of bed into my painting chair, that would be my preference. Showering, feeding the dogs, and packing lunch feels like such a major hurdle. Luckily for me, this week's sponsor can cover at least one of those. Factor takes the stress out of early morning responsibilities. Skip the grocery stores, prep work, and cooking. Instead, eat stress-free with ready-to-eat meals that are fresh and never frozen, delivered right to your door. Even as someone who's fairly invested in cooking, work week lunches are not something I'm looking to express my culinary creativity with. I want easy, healthy sustenance, and after a week of eating factor meals, they hit that metric. Every single meal I ate was a combination of protein and at a minimum 2 vegetables. I was feeling healthy throughout the week. Choose from a weekly menu of 35 options, including popular selections like Calorie Smart, Keto, Protein Plus, or Vegan and Veggie. Also, you can discover more than 60 add-ons like breakfast, on-the-go lunch, snacks, and beverages. They sent me a healthy juice to try, and it was pretty great, honestly. Drank every single one. Factor also offers Gourmet Plus meals, which means you can get a little fancy with your meal plan whenever you're craving something a little extra special. My favorite from amongst those gourmet options was spinach and mushroom chicken thighs that, even after 2 minutes of microwaving, was still cooked well. I expected it to be completely overcooked, but I was happy to be wrong. Head to factor75.com or click on the link below and use the code 50Miniac to get 50% off plus free shipping on your first Factor box. That's code 50Miniac at factor75.com to get 50% off plus free shipping on your first box. All right, back to painting Drazar. Moving on to the yellow armor, the story is kind of the same. With a nice and saturated gold and yellow, I apply an initial highlight. I'm using Vallejo game color here, and some of the paints in that range are actually pretty transparent. Most of the times, transparency in a paint like this is a bad thing. But when you're trying to blend into a surface that you applied a wash to and you can't exactly replicate the color, it's actually a pretty nice thing. I apply a little bit of paint, wash my brush out, and then blend the paint into the existing surface with a clean but damp brush. This technique is also known as feathering, and it's made more simple by a paint that's thick but also transparent, like some Vallejo game color paints like yellow and red. For the skin tone, I started with a palette of light yellow, a dark Caucasian skin tone, a mauve color, and a white. I mixed the mauve and skin tone together to get a slightly purple base coat to contrast with the yellow on the model, but also the yellow in the highlights. From here, I'll mix more of my yellow and white into this mixture to get several stages of highlights. I make sure to go slowly, increasing my brightness bit by bit, maybe even applying some layers multiple times to reach opacity. It's a small detail, a miniature's head, but treat it with care. If you want a deep dive into painting miniature heads, check out this video where I sit down with the beginner and we paint a head together while I share my steps and he asks some great questions. With the surrounding areas blocked in with some black color, I'm pretty happy with the skin tone and the eyes, so I wanted to do one last thing, which was to paint the veins or scarring on the side of his face. Because blue is an important spot color in my army, I decided to use a desaturated blue color here. I went a little bit too hardcore with the blue glazing, darkening down the skin tone a bit too much for my liking. To bring it back a little bit, I took some of that skin tone highlight that I've already been using and mixed it into my blue and then highlighted some of the more protruding parts of his facial scarring. For the hair, normally my Drakari have white hair, but I thought for this guy who is predominantly white, you could have black hair. And so I began by highlighting my black with the same color I used to glaze the scarring on his face. To get my black hair highlight, I simply mix white into this blue color that I'm using, which is dark sea blue from Vallejo. Next up, I worked on his face mask, which started with a dark silver base coat, avoiding only the deepest recesses. Following that, I applied a bright silver highlight to the edges of the mask, underside of the holes, and the top of his nose. On a small feature like this face mask, I don't feel the need to go through many layers of highlights. A dark base coat and a bright silver highlight will do just fine. Lastly, I work on the combat drugs hose that runs to his mask, starting with quite an enchanted blue base coat, quickly elevating to a turquoise highlight. I want this stuff to look like freaking drugs on crack. Drugs on drugs! Yo, I heard you like drugs, so we put some drugs in your drugs so you can get high while you getting high. Lastly, I like to dot on a very bright blue highlight, which in my head is simulating the bubbles that are kind of coursing through the hose as the drugs are pumped into these guys' veins. Time for some metallics, which are mostly tiny little studs littered all over the model. Because we took the time to outline all of these spikes either with an oil wash or a corrective recess shade with acrylic paint, all we need to do right now is just dot them very gingerly with a very bright silver, and they'll pop out and look awesome. For some of the larger elements, I paint them with a darker silver with the anticipation of washing them later in a nice blue color and then doing one final highlight. With the metallics done, I can now work on the broken soul stones littering his back wingdinger things, or as my buddy Jay from Eons of Battle would say, his back flimflams. At the same time, I'll also work on his combat drug tubes, and similar to the one on his face, I'm gonna base coat in a nice enchanted blue color, highlight in a teal, and then do 1 or 2 stippled highlights with bright turquoise and also white. At this stage, I want to glue on the head just because I'm done painting everything that the head would block, and I want to see what it looks like. And after much trial and tribulation getting the head glued on, it looks pretty good. I'm actually really happy with this unhelmeted head. He looks super mean. Moving on to one of the last parts of the model, let's talk about the weapons. In the past, I've done weapons on my incubi in a lot of different ways, and they all just take too much work and don't look that good. For Drazar's weapons, I'm going to first paint them in Molotov Chrome. The trick is to flood the surface of the sword blade with as much Molotov Chrome as you dare to get full opacity, but also to hopefully never go back to it a second time. Now, ideally, you would never apply Molotov Chrome with a paintbrush. This stuff looks best when it's fully opaque and you're also not disturbing the paint as it's drying. Unlike most acrylic paints, if you run your paintbrush through this stuff 5 seconds after applying it, you will totally murder the chrome look of the paint. In a perfect world, I wouldn't have assembled Drazar before painting him, but we're here now, so let's deal with it. With the silver paint mostly dried, I took some Tamiya clear blue and thinned it with some X20A, Tamiya's thinner, and then airbrushed it on the blades and other weapons. Before painting the rest of the blade, I made sure to paint the recessed runes on his weapon a nice teal color. And with that done, I'm going to paint the rest of the weapon in black. And while I'm painting over the runes, I'm making sure to hold my brush parallel to the surface. I don't want the tip of my brush getting down into those runes. I'm gonna run the very side of my brush along the surface of the paint to maintain that nice teal lettering. With the model all done, it's time to work on its base. Because I already put some dirt down and the bottom of Drazar's scenic base is nice and flat, I had a gap around the outside to fill with some milliput. Once I hit that work with some dirt and sealed it down with super glue thin, I base coated the whole base in a nice rich ochre color. I then tried to use contrast paint Black Templar on the rest of the ruined temple bits, but I wasn't the biggest fan of the outcome, so I just base coated over it in black. Then with some dry brushing, I applied a series of highlights. To get a lighter gray color, I actually mixed in the exact same ochre color that I just used into my black. At the very end, I mixed in a little bit of white to get a nice brighter edge highlight. Continuing on, I base coated the thorns that same military green that you see on the miniature. I often like to use the base to reinforce color decisions that I made earlier on the figure. With all my parts base coated, I applied an all-over enamel wash of a very light and dusty off-white. With the enamel wash dry, I took a mixture of inks that basically result in a muddy orange color and airbrushed the rim around the edge. I love the super saturated color this makes on top of the bright enamel wash, but it also draws some focus to the center of the base. Lastly, I busted out a bunch of different basing elements. Some micro tufts, some larger tufts, some long grasses, and whatnot. With those all glued down, I painted the base rim black, and my version of Drazar is finally complete. I'm super happy with how this model turned out, especially when you think about how long I took to paint him. I used the exact same steps on my unit of incubi, and he still looks great as an individual character. This series of Dark Elder videos on my channel is a collaboration I'm doing with the great and terrible Jay from Eons of Battle, who challenged me to paint up a 2,000 point army from Warhammer 40K by the end of 2024. He's also doing the same thing with a super different scheme, and you should definitely check out his videos. I don't watch a lot of hobby YouTube, but Jay is definitely one that I watch whenever a video drops. His excitement, charisma, and energy is just so infectious. I decided to sit down with a friend of mine who knows the rules of 40K to help me build a list so I can cram the rest of this army into the rest of my videos for 2024, and Warhammer 40K armies are big. Like, they're so much bigger than Age of Sigmar. What is going on? Drazar himself is only a measly 75 points. I have a ways to go. Jay was generous enough to extend this challenge to the end of March, notably when Adepticon is happening, so we can have our final showdown at the con, which I think is a perfect fit. Thanks, Jay. I have a lot of exciting additions to make to this army still, notably a unit of 18 Reaver jet bikes. Oh my gosh, I cannot wait for that. I don't care if it's bad. I want just a sick sci-fi biker gang zooming around the battlefield. That sounds so epic. So subscribe so you don't miss those videos. If you guys liked this video, I'll have several more of the Dark Eldar series linked at the end and also down in the description. If you like the channel and you want to support it, there are a number of ways to do that. All things linked down in the description, notably a Patreon campaign that gets you access to a Discord server where you and I can hang out any day of the week and chat about your miniature painting projects, or who the true identity of Drazar is. Is he a fallen Phoenix Lord? Is it an empty suit of armor with all dust inside? Is it Kermit the Frog? Let's debate. Another great way to support the channel is by checking out all of my affiliate links down in the description whenever you're making hobby purchases, or checking out my web store, Miniac.co, where I sell a bunch of stuff like miniatures, cutting mats, brush boxes, and a bunch of merch. Subscribe or die! And most importantly, don't forget to...